Because art is symbolical and thus perceivable and knowable, art has a certain aesthetic, an arrangement of forms, language, images, tunes, etc. Because it describes action, art has a narrative, even if it does not directly tell a story, like a building or a symphony. It still has inherent structure and meaning, and thus purpose, as well as a hierarchy of value, therefore morality, and so is embedded in a cosmic narration of a conflict between opposing forces. But are there universal aesthetic or narrative rules? I will present what I think to be very helpful in approaching what constitutes the aesthetic and narration of true and great art. Let's begin with narrative. Narration is more clear than aesthetics because narratives are creating a story based on and involving the differing archetypical structures described by Carl Jung in the last video of this series, embodying the complexity of mankind's spiritual and corporeal reality, with all the therein possible moral choices, as well as their varying outcomes. There are several modes of narrative representation, universal to all human cultures due to their shared collective unconscious, as this universality is called by Jung. And several scholars tried to list these different strategies of universally telling a story. For example, William Foster Harris, The Basic Patterns of Plot, who asserts that there are only 3 basic plot patterns, which involve man's capacity for choice and the limits of his agency. They could be broken down to the protagonist choosing either the right moral sacrifice or the wrong moral sacrifice, with the third plot being his destiny not hinging on a moral decision of his, but on fate, which often leads towards a tragic outcome. Christopher Booker's The 7 Basic Plots, on the other hand, cites 7 possible narrative structures, specifying the bare-bone structure of Foster Harris into more particular manifestations, within which the possibility for moral action and agency can be played out. They are overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, i.e. the light-hearted resolve of an adverse circumstance into a cheerful ending, tragedy, i.e. the hero's fall due to his inner flaws, and rebirth, i.e. the transformation of the protagonist's personality. The author Ronald Tobias comparatively researched 20 master plots that basically divides Booker's previous ones into more nuanced and particular categories. George Palti comparatively topped Tobias in detailed categorization, with 36 dramatic situations. But whatever the precise number of narrative possibilities in their exact detail may be, no matter if one tale tells these differing plots separately or combined, these categories and possible even more subcategories of narration, I do propose they still hold on to be true in their universal appeal to humanity, because their general essence distills the meanings of the archetypical images, when ready to be turned into concrete, culturally specific form. They speak a universal truth about the human condition, shared by all men, despite varying in detail, despite being differentially manifested. Broadly speaking, every tribe of man tells the same general stories. But every culture bestows her own flavor onto these archetypical universals of narrative potential in their particular artistic realization. Thus, it is more complicated to define a set of universal aesthetic rules. Yet, I nevertheless will try to discover aesthetic universals. Filmmaker Paul Schrader, while talking about how to establish a canon of essential works for the art of cinema, gives 7 areas where an artwork has to succeed and exceed in order to be regarded as truly great. In my opinion, these offered realms of quality are very helpful and accurate for assessing true and great art in general. They are as follows: A. Beauty. B. Strangeness, as an alternative term to originality, something we can never altogether assimilate. C. Unity of form and subject matter. D. Tradition. E. Repeatability, i.e. timelessness. F. Viewer engagement. And G. Morality. Let us begin with the last point of morality. Schrader states that morality is a criterion that stretches from Plato, who equated aesthetic education and moral goodness, through Kant, the aesthetic as a path to moral goodness, to Ruskin and Lewis, every great work is a great moral work. One can't depict real-life situations, develop characters, and tell stories over time without moral ramifications. To paraphrase the injunction Jung had inscribed on his gravestone, called or not, morality will be there. Essentially, this notion resembles the notion of archetypical representation outlined by me above in connection to narration, and therefore we do not have to repeat its content again. Next, viewer engagement. Schrader, in regards to films, says, "A great film is one that to some degree frees the viewer from passive stupor and engages him or her in a creative process of viewing. The dynamic must be two-way. The great film not only comes at the viewer, it draws the viewer toward it. The film, either by withholding expected elements or by positing contradictions, causes the viewer to reach into the screen, as it were, and move the creative furniture around. This isn't a viewer trying to guess who done it. This instead is a viewer making identifications he or she had no intention of making, coming to conclusions the film can't control, reassembling the film in a unique personal way. A great film, a film that endures, demands and receives the viewer's creative complicity. For me, this is true to every form of art as well. The artwork demands from the viewer to participate in the creation of the work itself, both by mental work while perceiving it, but also as a source of inspiration for his own life to either emulate or avoid. Whatever final plan the creator had in mind while making it, the work is imitated, expanded, and created anew by the viewer. Let's continue with repeatability. Schrader claims great art holds up. It can be experienced repeatedly. It can be appreciated by successive generations. It grows in importance and context with time. To ensure repeatability, there is the interpretive richness of certain works of art. An artwork is comprised of many layers. It can be analyzed like Catholics did scripture, on a moral, allegorical, literal, or anagogical level. It can be interpreted to mean many different things for many different people simultaneously, regardless of age, sex, or culture, even contradictory ones, without offering a final, complete, and definitive explanation. It does not matter if there was one certain reading intended by its creator. The text is often smarter or deeper than its author. True and great art has no bottom, for there are always new things to be discovered within a particular piece. True and great art is nearly inexhaustible in its potential of explorative meaning, and at every time, for every new generation, rebirths eternally anew. There are only a certain number of tellable stories, but unlimited ways to present and embody them, either in imagination or in reality, either in game or in serious social action. Now to tradition. T.S. Eliot claims in Tradition and the Individual Talent, no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. Bloom picks up this argument in the Western canon. Tradition is not only a handing down or process of benign transmission, it is also a conflict between past genius and present aspiration, in which the prize is literary survival or canonical inclusion. Learning from one's predecessors, but also trying to transcend them, securing the flame and not the ashes, creating a living and breathing organism of being, connected to past, present, and future, living eternally, steady and changing, one and many at the same time. Out of this agon of competing strife for artistic excellency also arises the idea of the canon, a list of representative, essential, and finest works or actors in a certain field of human achievement, national or international, creating a shared identity and history, producing a common frame of reference in regard to a specific domain of interest or action, standardizing practices, rules, and definitions in a particular area, a hierarchy of value, and therefore morality, thus making communication and understanding, in short, living together, possible. Only through that can righteous action, which ensures humanity to survive and thrive, be determined, and therefore salvation for all men, in body and soul. This is why we play as children, and this is why we create art. Let's now follow up tradition with form. The greatness and excellence of art, Hegel states, will depend upon the degree of intimacy with which form and subject matter are fused and united. But form also includes the question of how to tell a story, either archetypical, as was discussed previously, or natural, meaning realistic, or overtly psychological and materialistic, lacking definitive moral character in its narration. Yet a fundamental difference between archetypical and natural modes of representation does not really exist, for archetypical forms are already psychological ones, as we have seen by the work of Carl Jung. Nature is cloaked in the poetry of myth to make it accessible and engaging, but trying to forcefully divorce naturalist elements from their mythic roots only leads to staleness to time and ideological entrapment of the certain artwork that engages in this strategy. Being constructed in this last way, it fails as art, which then either becomes propaganda for contemporary ideologies, or a nihilistic deconstruction of the universal truth represented in the archetypical form, leaving only a meaningless carnal reading of reality, without hope for any betterment of the spiritual or material condition of humanity. There is a balance to be held between the realism of nature and the possible artificiality of the symbolism within archetypical presentation. This has to be avoided. A. That we create essence without existence, like an overly abstract painting, where an idea about the nature of existence is tried to be conveyed without an embodiment in matter, becoming at best only a decorative element. Or, on the other hand, B. Existence without essence, like in photorealist painting, which is barely more than a look out of the window. There, life just becomes material and is not organized by an overarching logos that gives it meaning. True art must be truer than either mere material or ideal truth. It must be meta-truth, to feel artificial and realistic simultaneously, being held together by a suspension of disbelief, perfectly organized by reason, and yet chaotic like the randomness of the colliding particles in matter. Existence and essence fall together as a correspondence between the reality of the mind and the reality of the thing. This then is truth, and in art this truth is channeled by beauty, which we will discuss later. In this scenario, a leap of faith to bridge these opposing realms is required to enjoy true art, for it dances on the tightrope of not letting a symbol transform into an apparent fake, shallow and pretentious, or an object into mere atoms, hollow and meaningless. Or, as Friedrich Nietzsche states in The Birth of Tragedy, art is not merely an imitation of the reality of nature, but in truth a metaphysical supplement to the reality of nature, placed alongside whereof for its conquest. And, in The Will of Power, we have art, so that we may not perish by the truth. The next area in Schrader's essay is strangeness. Harold Bloom uses the term strangeness in lieu of the more common originality. Strangeness is the type of originality that we can never altogether assimilate. The concept of strangeness enriches the traditional notion of originality, adding the connotation of unpredictability, unknowability, and magic. This strangeness, this unpredictable burst of originality, is the attribute of a work of art that causes successive generations to puzzle over it, to debate it, to be awed by it. Imagine in a work of art elements that in any other context should not fit together, a wild and weird mix of all kinds of subsections of aesthetic systems, themes and narratives, high and low culture, elitism and popular appeal, radical tonal shifts or contrasts, seemingly random, crazy or contradictory, but nevertheless, for some unexplainable reason, still working, still making sense, unifying oppositional states or ideas into a third, a paradoxical transcendence, something located almost in irreverent parody or even blasphemy, but in reality achieving a deep and earnest spiritual transcendence. But this can only be accomplished by knowing the rules of a specific category or genre of art. Only then can we bend its inherent rules. Art also means craft. Only by learning a trade we can master it. Only by this knowledge we can progress and try new forms by experimentation, by rearrangement of established patterns, or even better, by finding new possibilities in the explored and unexplored regions of a particular artistic field. This is the way archetypes work too. We learn the meta-truth behind the fashioned specific symbol of the archetypical image, and thus are able to utilize it in our particular situation outside of fictional myth. The last point to be discussed is beauty. Beauty is not only defined by rules and attributes like symmetry, harmony, variety within unity, aesthetic emotion, all of which science indicates is innate in our brain, and 80% of it is shared by all men if it comes to the human form. Or, as Thomas Aquinas puts it, recta ratio factibilium, the right reason in regard to the making of things, the rectitude of understanding the forms that God had already placed in nature. For Aquinas, this perception leads to ethics, which in his words is recta ratio agibilium, right reason in regard to action, the rectitude of conformity to the finality of God's law, which as a whole is strikingly similar to the notion of the archetype in regards to children's play acting, as laid out in the previous video. But beauty is also defined by its ability to qualitatively transform reality. Crispin Sartwell points the way to an expanded appreciation of beauty in his book 6 Names of Beauty, seeking to free the word beauty from its cliché-ridden contemporary usage. Sartwell relocates it in disparate cultures. Beauty, English, the object of longing. Yafa, Hebrew, glow, bloom. Sundara, Sanskrit, whole, holy. Tokkalon, Greek, idea, ideal. Wabi-sabi, Japanese, humility, imperfection. And Hosso, Navajo, health, harmony. Beauty in this sense is rather instinctively felt, rather than reasoned as it would be through mathematical rules like symmetry or harmony. To that array of newly definitory states, we might add Edwin Burke's categorization of the sublime as contrasted to the beautiful. Compared to the beautiful, which is well formed and aesthetically pleasing, the sublime is that which has the power to overwhelm and awe, to compel or transform our minds. Beauty is multi-faced, both spiritual as well as corporal, but the old saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is not true. Beauty is universal. It is beauty's specific depending on the particular person's or his particular culture's aesthetic realization that sits in the beholder's eye. To explain this universality, I will quote Plato, who said, "Beauty is the splendor of truth," which summarizes part of his view on the so-called transcendentals, the trias of the good, the true, and the beautiful. For Plato, as he writes in The Republic, the form of the good is akin to the sun, meaning an agent that makes us perceive things clearly and truthfully, generating knowledge and wisdom. Taken together with his stance in the work The Symposium, that beauty is the guide to truth, this represents the view of Plato on beauty and its connection to truth and goodness. He argues in The Symposium that one first loves the beautiful body of a particular person, then all beautiful bodies, then, abstracting from that, the beautiful mind or soul of a certain person, and then, having finally received the knowledge that lies behind the corporal form, one begins to love the fundamental universal truth grounding all of reality, the logos of creation. Through aesthetic beauty, man is educated in morality and in truth, and thus, if a society abandons beauty, it loses this ability and therefore is doomed.